This is Mara and Ben for Stellar Strategy Gaming, and today we're going to be talking about necromancers in Dungeons & Dragons. Now, traditionally necromancers, or anybody who has much contact with the undead, is automatically a villain, so we're going to be exploring the options for making a character who raises the dead who may not be a bad guy. In addition to the necromancer wizard, there is also the Spore Circle druid. It has some spells and capabilities that are specifically geared toward that. Now, Mara, I know you've played both the Spore Circle druid and the necromancer wizard, so obviously I have to ask a question that's been eating up the Dungeons & Dragons community. If I know both talk with plants and speak with dead, can I talk to furniture?
Yes, I would say so, as a professional DM, definitely.
Awesome. So we're going to start with your thoughts on this. If you wanted to make a necromancer, not even necessarily a good guy, just a more interesting character than the sort of ghoul who's not the ghoul as in the CR, whatever it is, monster ghoul in a figurative sense, who's sort of lurking around graveyards and being essentially creepy for its own sake, how would you go about putting that character together?
Well, I'd say that you could definitely have a character who's, again, neutral or good, where their mentality is very practical in nature. I mean, some of the worst pandemics in history have been caused because the water supply mixed with a graveyard during flooding or whatever. I believe typhus specifically can outbreak because of that. And so you can have communities and characters where instead of burying their dead near their water supply and everyone getting sick every 10 years, you have it be that they just keep the dead around, raised all the time, and those dead can do some menial work or even just go off to fight battles. Not good per se, but it's definitely a more practical use, and within the lore and within real-world examples, if you could do that kind of thing, it might be incredibly beneficial.
Now, would you be talking about a situation like the Amonkhet expansion in Magic the Gathering, where they essentially have what amounts to just a sort of standing army of undead who do all the menial work of the society?
A bit, yes, though I'd say that the undead as we see them in Amonkhet would actually be closer to what I would consider to be the good spectrum, because the undead very much exist to create sort of a post-scarcity society for the citizens of Amonkhet. It is addressed that all of the needs of the citizens are completely covered for. In fact, I was going to use that example later for my good guy approach, which is to have someone who just goes around raising undead because, hey, it's free labor, you don't have to force anyone to do it, because you just have all these corpses lying around that aren't doing anything.
That's fair. And so the explanation I heard for how the Spore Circle druid would work was described as reduce, reuse, reanimate, which isn't necessarily so different from what you're talking about. Dead people or dead animals could be seen as a resource that would, there again, post-scarcity, and from a druid's perspective, having laborers who don't necessarily need to be fed or paid could potentially be a way to sort of reconcile the needs of preserving the natural world. Can you give me a little bit more specific example? What kind of backstory would your character have? How would you sort of play this character you're thinking of?
Well, if they're coming from a society where necromancy is already more okay than others, like that town scenario I laid out, or like a Amonkhet, you could just have it be basically any normal background that involves magic. I will say that for Spore Circle Druid, that you're limited in backgrounds to a few things just because of the nature of the Druid class. I won't specify what kinds of things other than, like, Hermit, for example. But that's more of a class thing, not a subclass, not an ability thing, in my opinion. Whereas if you're a wizard, Town Doctor probably has a few necromancy-based spells. I mean, True Resurrection is a necromancy spell, and clerics know that one, or very high-level ones do. So it also shows that even what is considered to be bad necromancy is still in the same family as what is considered to be good necromancy.
Well, there is the saying, necromancers are just healers with really bad timing. I hadn't thought about that, but there are a few domains of cleric that are, at the very least, flirting, like Death Domain and Grave Domain are flirting with necromancy, if not fully into it. I don't have their spell list right at my fingertips, but that makes a lot of sense. What I had envisioned would be something where you might have a character who, let's say their town is about to be attacked. It's a situation where, so to use a real world example, you're part of some Gaulish village in what's now France, and Julius Caesar is marching over the horizon with his legion, and you know that your illiterate farmers who only learned how to wash their own asses last week don't stand much of a chance against a Roman formation. So you go to the cemetery and you just start raising everybody to go and fight. And if they can't win against the legion, maybe they buy everybody time to escape, or make it enough of a fight that the legions will negotiate rather than just raising the town.
Yeah, in fact, I'd argue that that's a large part of the reason why necromancy is viewed in such a bad light in the majority of modern interpretations, is because if you think about the societies that had had concepts similar to necromancy in the real world, it was like Egypt, and a lot of Celtic peoples and the Vikings had very ancestor worship or spirit involved things going on, and those tended to be outside of the very homogenous empires which rose up and established dominance. And so in pushing out those cultures and religions, they also pushed out the ideals of those cultures and religions.
So to go a little bit more into that, so the sort of the Christian ideal of like you bury somebody, and even the Greco-Roman ideal of you do certain things for the dead, like put coins in their eyes or put a coin under the tongue, so they have a way to pay the ferryman to get across the river Styx to go to the underworld. Because raising the person would be a perversion of that. I guess you're saying that's why our culture views it as inherently evil?
Yes, and so in D&D, I'd be of the opinion that especially a DM who comes out from outside of the Western scope, or even just the Christian scope of things to a certain degree, would be able to do a much better non-biased view of necromancy. I find it difficult to do an unbiased view of necromancy just due to the culture I grew up in. I mean, Skeletor was a major part of my childhood, for example, so it is a bit difficult to do it, but if you can pull it off, you can also bring some very interesting conversations to your table, which will make it more interesting for the players as well.
Now, something I want to touch on in this video is that in the Dungeons & Dragons lore, there is actually a specific place where things like zombies and skeletons get their energy from. AJ Pickett in the Mighty Glue Stick channel did an excellent video on it. I do recommend it. But basically, when a necromancer raises a skeleton or a zombie, they actually draw an entity from the negative energy plane. And when that entity arrives in the prime material and inhabits a dead body, it perceives everything that's alive around it as the same way you might perceive an alarm that is a loud noise with a bright flashing light. It's just constant, and because everything in the prime material is sort of alive, it creates this hateful entity, and that's why the undead are just inherently hostile, is because it's this bright flashing noise all around them, and they hate it, and they just feel the need to extinguish it. So that could create a really interesting sort of plot point for your necromancer, and it could create some interesting ethical discussions if you're running that kind of campaign, because you could have a necromancer who starts out not knowing that. They're just not really understanding where the energy that raises the dead is coming from, and not realizing that they're sort of torturing this entity from another reality by bringing them into that. And that could be a really interesting sort of focal point for the character. Is they're like a level 6 necromancer, at which point level 6 wizard, you're getting up there in power, but then all of a sudden they realize the way they're doing it is kind of horrible.
Yes, and you can even get into conversations and whole plot lines around the fact that those entities don't really truly exist on the negative energy plane. Like if you put the entity that inhabits a zombie back in the negative energy plane, it sort of just fades into the background again. And so you can bring up, is the plane alive? Because it's manifestations of planar energy. And at that point, you get into very interesting discussions about every spell. But I think that's a conversation for another time.
Oh, for sure. I would like to also give one example of what I think was a great example of a necromancer who was done very well. And that was the character of Isaac from Castlevania. He starts out evil. He's working for Dracula, and the expressed goal is to wipe out humanity. But over time, his views on things soften a little bit, and even a character who he's sworn revenge against, Hector, he abandons that plan. He spares Hector when the time comes, even though Hector pretty much gives himself up willingly. And Isaac never stops being a necromancer. He never stops performing necromancy. He even creates a horrific undead monstrosity for it to sort of be his buddy and have conversations with, since most of the undead don't talk. So it's definitely doable. Like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's definitely something that it can be done. It has been done, and I certainly recommend you play around with this. I always love having characters that sort of break the mold.
Yes, and my sort of final thought as well is that you also can see great examples of not necessarily good necromancy, but necromancy which serves a purpose for a civilization in modern gaming right now. There's actually been a resurgence of necromancy that isn't just for the evil playthroughs or whatever it is. In the game Endless Legend, there are the necrophage, who turn everything they consume back into a living organism. It's not true necromancy, but it's pretty close. And then in Stellaris, there's a literal necromancy perk which allows your civilization to raise undead armies, which might allow you to defend from the conquering swarm of a hive mind, you know? And with that, I'm going to say that I hope that this has inspired some new creative choices among all of you, especially in regards to necromancy, as that's what this is about. And with that, we hope that you like and subscribe. Perhaps leave a few comments if you have any unique ideas.
Yes, please do let us know. If I multi-class my bard with a necromancer, is that a Ouija bard or a necrodancer?